So I want to thank NIJ for funding this work. Secretary LaHood has referred to distracted driving as an epidemic. And we've shown, and others have shown, that even moderate levels of multitasking can influence, can lead to worse driving performance. However, one of the big problems is that law enforcement officers are absolutely required to multitask to do the job. Among other things, officers during patrol must drive safely, examine the environment for potential violations, manage service calls from dispatch, and track their own location as well as the location of other officers. All of these things are requiring them to put on cognitive load. And in other words, they're actually using part of their mental capacity to take care of different things other than simply avoiding other cars. Well, what we wanted to know was whether or not communication with dispatch could influence the way that people are, way the officers are driving and performing their jobs. We wanted to look at the form of dispatch communications. Now, what we mean by form is that we examined both the classic 10 codes. For example, in Starkville, Mississippi, a 1078 is a suspicious person. So dispatch would call out a 1078 at the corner of North and Short. That requires the officer and the dispatcher to both decode that information into what it actually means and then respond appropriately. Another form of communication is referred to as natural language, which is more like how one would normally refer to things. There is a suspicious person at the corner of North and Short, which doesn't require that same kind of decoding, but it does take more time over the radio to communicate. So there's a trade-off in either way, and we wanted to see whether or not changing the type of communication actually influenced the load that the officer was under. Another thing that we were interested in was whether or not in-car technology could be used to help alleviate this cognitive demand. And in our case, we were using a really simple idea of what in-car technology could be, simply telling the officer what was the last call that they had received, just on a computer display. So what we did was we had officers patrol a simulated city. Now we had law enforcement officers from the northeast Mississippi area. They were patrolling the simulated city there up in the upper right, and that city is not real. Totally, no one had ever been in it before, and so they were just patrolling a brand new area. And beside that, you see a picture of the cab that we have in our simulator. Now, in our simulator, we had a radio that was there, that microphone sitting on the passenger seat, as well as a mobile data terminal simulator. Now that simulator just either had a static map of the environment so that officers would know what they were looking for, or it would echo the calls from dispatch. So the dispatcher's calls would actually appear in text form on that display. Now our officers patrolled 5 different times through this environment, and we used different types of communication. So we had a baseline where no dispatch communication was occurring, and the MDT simulator was just showing the static map. We then crossed natural language with the MDT simulator either being active or inactive, and the 10 codes being active or inactive. Now during each drive, the officer would respond to service calls, 2 of them in each one of the drives, as well as environmental events. So these would be events like all of a sudden a child runs across the road. All of our officers said they would stop and talk to the child. A fight breaks out on the side of the road. These are all simulated actors in our little simulation. And they would actually stop and report about that. And each one of these drives took 12 to 20 minutes. Now, what did we measure? Well, we measured driving performance, vehicular control, like whether or not they were steering more erratically or pressing on the accelerator or not, and how well they were maintaining their lane position. We also analyzed eye tracking performance. Now, eye tracking is a way of analyzing attentional deployment. Officers are trained and encouraged to keep a wide breadth of attentional deployment, so they should keep their eyes moving around the environment. And finally, we examined situation awareness. Now, situation awareness is a way of examining whether or not the officer knows what is going on at this time and can predict what things are going to happen next. We examine questions such as, what type of event did you reply to? What do the suspects or victims look like? Where are you? And what are the other officers doing in the area? Now, this last one is actually very challenging because there's no direct information in the device or anywhere in the simulation except for the radio call. So the officer is actually constantly updating that information as they're going along. Now, we have a little video here of what the officers did. Now, in this case,
Adam 6.
wait for a second.
Adam 6, go ahead, dispatch.
Adam 6, be on lookout for a suspicious woman in a gray shirt near the 200 block of East Juniper Street.
Copy.
All right, so we have an officer actually patrolling. We blurred his face in the kind of dragnet to protect the innocent idea. And we can see the different views. The one in the lower right is actually what is going on with an overlay. There's a little green dot that occasionally you'll be able to see. It's kind of washed out in this thing. But that's where the officer is actually looking at
Adam
this
5,
moment.
go ahead.
I've arrived at the scene.
All right, so, and you hear those are
Copy,
other
Adam
officers
5.
responding to dispatch calls. So this is a natural language condition. The officers are communicating without the 10 code information.
Adam 6 to dispatch.
Adam 6, go ahead.
Dispatch, I've arrived at the scene.
Copy, Adam 6.
So now the officer, our officer who is Adam 3, would have had to update that Adam 6 has actually arrived at the location and where that location was and keep that in their mental frame. Now, as soon as our officer goes through this stoplight, which is about to turn, he's actually going to come up on the vehicular accident that he was called to respond to.
Dispatch to Adam 7.
So you can see, if you
Adam
can
7,
see the little green
go
dot,
ahead,
he's actually
dispatch.
looking right at it right now. And he
Adam
pulls
7,
over.
we have a disturbance at 109 North Woods Avenue.
And when he stops the vehicle, we actually take the simulation down, and there it goes to black. And the officer now is asked a series of questions about what had just happened, a multiple choice series of questions. So we were looking at three different things. The first thing we looked at were the eye tracking results. And in this case, we actually have good news. The type of communication that the officers were receiving had no influence on how broadly they spread their attention across the entire environment. They equally distributed their attention across all types of communication. And this may indicate that the training that officers receive is sufficient to overcome any kind of cognitive load that they're actually under. Now, with respect to the driving performance, we have some mixed results here. The natural language condition actually led to greater throttle variability. In other words, they were standing on the gas and brake more, or standing on the gas more or less in that condition than in the other conditions. And there isn't any real danger in that, it's just that they were more variable. However, with respect to lane offset, which one can think of as being very important, whether or not you're staying in your own lane or not, the 10 code conditions tended to show that officers were under a little more strain in that case of trying to maintain their lane position. They were actually maintaining their lane position farther away from the center, probably because they were under more load. Now, finally, in our situation awareness questions, now these are questions about whether or not the officer knows what's going on at the time. We find that in the baseline condition, these are misses. What percentage of times do they miss the answers? Under the baseline, they miss about 10% of the questions. Now, these are sometimes difficult questions because we're asking very detailed questions of like what color was the shirt that the person was wearing or something like that. And so it's not uncommon that one would have that. But the real interesting situation here is that the officers in our city use 10 codes without any technological aid, which is actually the condition that they do the worst in here. So the condition in which they have the most experience is the condition that they're actually performing the worst in. Now, However, if you add in technology, if you add in just that simple little thing saying 1078 corner of this and this, the officers all of a sudden revert to a level that is equivalent to their baseline performance with no dispatch communications. Natural language fell in between and didn't really have any influence of the driving simulator. So in conclusion, law enforcement officers' attentional deployment is not dramatically affected by the types of communication that they are provided, which is a good thing. They are looking around the environment and responding correctly. However, lane offset and situation awareness may show some differences with 10-code communications, and that could lead to greater cognitive demand. So it seems like there's an effort to decode the information, and that can lead to decreased performance. But technology within the vehicle may be able to alleviate some of these negative consequences. Now, I should say that we had a relatively small sample, and we were using primarily rural police officers. Starkville, Mississippi is not a particularly large place, and the amount of communication that they were receiving was relatively high for a day, but they said it was more like a Saturday night in town when there were more communication. But that's it, and I'd like to thank my Brett Chapman, sorry about that wrong, the NIJ program officer, and my two co-investigators, Daniel Caruth and Tina Garrison. Thank you.